Tall pumps and short pumps. These are some Mercedes specific terms that some of you might be familiar with if you have a fuel injected, a mechanically fuel injected Mercedes, because these two pumps were the pumps that all the mechanically fuel injected cars used from approximately 1958, excluding the 300 SL and the 300 Adenauer. So we're specifically talking about 220 SEs all the way to the end of the 600s production run. So this is the tall pump and this is the short pump. Little history on these pumps. Let's talk about the tall pump first. This beautiful electric fuel pump, which you can find mounted in the rear of the car on your classic Mercedes, was used from approximately 1958 when they developed the 220 SE. And I'm not entirely sure. I've never seen a super early pump because almost all of them were replaced. But this was the pump that you would find under a W128 or a W111 or a W112 all the way until March of 1968. And then I think, I might be wrong, but I think in March of 1968, so that means that early 280 SLs and 280 SEs came with it as well, they invented this pump, the short pump, das kleine Pumpe. The short pump was used starting March of 68 and was basically the de facto pump used on cars that had mechanical fuel injection, not D-Jetronic injection, all the way up until the 600 was canceled. And so this pump and this pump may look, they look very beefy and overbuilt, and that's because they had to deliver a liter of fuel consistently every 30 seconds. Now this is one of those scenarios where having a large volume of fuel is necessary to feed a fuel system like the one in a 300 SEL 6.3 or a 600, where your fuel needs can get pretty beefy when you're at full throttle trying to feed 6.3 liters of engine. And today, there really aren't a lot of pumps that can perform and keep up with the volume needs of these cars. Now, eventually Mercedes came out with the dual fuel pump package system, which delivered a liter in 15 seconds. But the whole problem was that Mercedes needed a very, very high output pump that could run for long periods of time without getting fatigued, without cavitating, without experiencing high levels of brush wear. And really, these pumps, when they're working really well, and I'm talking about 100%, everything has been rebuilt properly, or you're dealing with an NOS pump, they will deliver a liter of fuel in 15 seconds. So they will really kick the fuel out, and it's because of this beautiful, efficient vane. But we found that even if they're delivering a liter of fuel in 30 seconds after they've been in operation for a while, they're still able to meet the fuel needs of the engine. So Mercedes built quite a bit of tolerance in there. Now, what these pumps do not do is produce a lot of pressure. So they favor volume over pressure. Whereas if you look at some of the later cars, they favor volume and pressure. Favoring volume over pressure is tricky because you want a lot of fuel, but you don't want to rupture the fuel hoses, the fuel damper diaphragms, overfill the injection pump, and overwhelm the fuel return system. So you can't just go into one of these cars guns blazing and start over delivering fuel. That's not good for the system either. You could end up with things like a cold start injector leaking into the intake manifold. You could even end up, with a fuel leakage from a hose or a damper on the engine that causes a fire. So you really want to understand why you need more volume than pressure. Now let's talk about how some of these pumps go wrong. Both of them have the same failure model, where as the pump ages, the brushes wear, and when the pump's been in operation for a period of time, it can't deliver enough fuel to the engine because the impeller and the motor assembly start to slow down. So these guys thrive on high RPMs, and because this thing has a bigger motor and it has more mass to it, it is more susceptible to failures of the motor itself. Now, the motors are entirely repairable and disassemblable. You can see this is a standard Bosch motor, almost looks like a wiper motor on a 113, where you could take the whole thing apart and rebuild it with new brushes and actually make it function exactly like it was supposed to when it was new, at least the mechanical part. But there's a lot of wear that has to be taken into account as well. So on these tall pumps, you have this weep hole, and this weep hole is to keep the pump from cavitating, to keep the pressure and temperature around the impeller and around the shaft from exceeding atmospheric pressure, because what you don't want is some sort of high pressure scenario that's going to cause the pump shaft to expand, overheat, and or bind or wear out prematurely. So this sort of helps with pressure equalization, but as the bushings inside the pump wear, you can get liquid discharge, as in gasoline discharge, out of this hole. Now, both of these pumps, the short pump and the tall pump, can develop this symptom where they start to get fatigued over time. But I've learned that the short pump, because I think it operates at an even higher RPM and it's more efficient, any sort of problems with the solder joints on the brushes, the solder joints for these terminals, the armature windings, the glue on the armature windings can lead to a motor failure. And these things are really put to the test. They operate at higher speeds. Now, unlike that pump, this pump is filled all the way up with fuel, and that's one of the characteristics of the short pump. In order to provide additional cooling for the motor, there is fuel present pervasively in the pump, throughout the pump. Now, most people would say, man, if there's an arc in there, there could be a fire. But actually, the truth is that this is an anaerobic environment. There's no oxygen. There's just liquid. So you can't have a spark unless you have air present. And because the whole thing is filled with fuel, there's really no arcing that can occur. You don't really get an arc on the armature. Gasoline is just like water in that nothing can burn under it. Only the vapors are really flammable. So as a result, even though these pumps run with gasoline through them and have big electric motors, they are not known for fires. They are not known for exploding. What they're known for is wearing out. Now, another problem with these is external leaks. Both of these pumps, if they have not been resealed in a long time, will develop external leaks from their rubber gaskets and O-rings. And when you take them apart to reseal them, they have to be polarized in the proper direction so that they spin in the correct direction. Other issues that occur include impeller wear and corrosion, as well as a tendency for them to get damaged by fuel contaminants such as rust in the tank. So these have inlet filters here and here, and the filters are responsible for sweeping any big debris out, but small particulates can damage those impellers and even lock them up. If the car sits around too long, which is another common problem, guess what will happen? The pump will become so varnished or gummed up that there's no way that it will be able to turn with the tight tolerances of the impeller. The impeller tolerance is very tight, and that's how they develop such immense volume, but they keep the pressure down, because an impeller, unlike a roller type pump, which is what a D-Jetronic system uses, will develop a lot of volume but won't just overpressurize the system. It's sort of how a water pump works. Now, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of using these pumps? Well, here are my top 3 advantages for them. Number 1, they are very well made, meaning that unless the bodies are extremely corroded, they are very repairable. Martin Worminghausen at 600 Air Suspension repairs these pumps for us. There are a number of rebuild services for the short pump, but he is the only person I know in the United States who does the tall pump and does a great job with it. That's 600airsuspension.com. The second thing I like about these pumps is they are generally very reliable. They don't seize. When they're in operation, they stay in operation. When they start to fail, they don't fail all at once. They will give you some warning signs such as low power and even coming back after you give them a 5-minute rest without operation. So if you shut them off, you let them rest for 5 minutes, suddenly they'll come back. But that's how you know they're starting to wear out. The third thing I like about these pumps, they are quiet. I like the fact that they are quiet. You don't hear, a while ago, some companies started marketing an aftermarket version of this pump, but it was extremely loud. In fact, it was so loud that it hurt. It literally sounded like somebody was running a blender under the car all the time. I don't like that. I like the silence of these pumps. I like the fact they don't produce a lot of vibration. You can barely tell they're there when the engine is off. With the engine, with just the ignition switched on, you can barely hear them. That's one of the things I really admire about them. Now the cons. The first con is that rebuilding them is expensive. So if you have a problem with one, there's no easy solution. You have to get it, you either have to disassemble and reseal it yourself, which you could end up damaging it if you don't know what you're doing, and a lot of people don't, and they don't make these anymore. Number two, if you have to buy an NOS one or you have to buy a buildable core, they're expensive. And then number three, there's another problem associated with these pumps, and that's that we mentioned earlier, they're very corrosion prone. So if they've been sitting around for a few years, the aluminum bodies of the pump, particularly the short pump, but the tall pump is not excluded either, can corrode so badly that you can't repair them. The second con is that internal parts are not really available. You can get new impellers, but if you need a shaft or an armature and you're not experienced at rebuilding these products, you have to find good used ones because internal parts are very hard to find. There is a rumor that new pump bodies are available out of Europe, but again, it's just a rumor. I think the third problem too is that a lot of mechanics, unless they're classic Mercedes specialists, are not familiar with these pumps. They don't understand their delivery parameters. They don't understand their failure signature. They don't understand how to evaluate them to determine if it's a pump problem or a dirty tank problem or an ignition problem. And so there's a lack of understanding about how these pumps work and why Mercedes favored them so much. So if you guys found this video to be useful, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're wondering whether your old short or tall pump is worth rebuilding, they certainly are. I love having them, and I found them to give me great service. So I look forward to seeing your comments about these pumps in the future. Take care and enjoy your classic Mercedes.